welcome. Welcome to the Phoenix Business Forum. Thanks so much for taking time out of your day to be here with us. I'm Presley Reader. This is Stephen Silvinski. And man, it's good to see you.
Good seeing you too.
Stephen and I go back a number of years. We have, I think, great conversations. I enjoy them no matter whether we're on a stage.
I'm glad you enjoy them.
Or we're in our backyards.
Right.
Lots of interesting stuff. We're going to talk about national debt. We're going to talk about economic recovery, inflation, economics in general. Lots to cover.
Yeah.
We'll have the Q&A session at the end. If you've got a question you want to ask, submit that. Before we get to that, I think in addition to drumming, it's good to just get to know you a little bit better. A couple things about you. You are married to an economist.
And my wife is here.
Your lovely
there
wife,
she is.
Crystal,
Thank you.
is here.
She promised me she wouldn't heckle, but
We'll see.
No guarantees.
Will we even know it's heckling if it's an economist? I don't even know.
It'll be done very sweetly, but you're right. It'll be done in jargon, and no one else will understand it. It's like yelling in Latin or something.
So two economists married to each other. I'm sure that brings up some interesting conversation. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that you've made an interesting pet choice. And there's an assumption in economics that people make rational choices.
Yeah.
I think that's fair.
That's fair.
But you made a pet choice.
Is it up there?
That I'm going to have you defend.
I defend it. All right, happy to do it.
From a rational standpoint.
Okay, so there's Winston.
Why?
Yeah,
This is Winston. This is Winston, the Silvinski's pet hairless cat.
Right, so now I'm very happy to defend our choice. And in fact, I'm glad you did this because I think Winston, that's the name of the cat, got a bum rap the last time. So I don't know if any of you guys saw this last year, because we did this almost like a year ago to the date practically.
Yeah.
And you started trash talking my cat like right off the bat. It was like really aggressive.
Yeah.
So I began to realize that, well, maybe this time we should show people, because it's one thing to say a hairless cat, but it's quite another to show it, right? And when people say hairless cat, I think most people, first of all, it's a Sphinx cat is the technical name for Winston.
Classy.
And so, but when you say hairless cat, you think Mr. Bigglesworth from Austin Powers, or something weird looking, right? But he's not weird looking. And personality goes a long way as well. And so the main reason we agreed, now, by the way, the reason we looked for hairless cats, and stop me if you've heard this one, is because our son has an allergy to pet hair, okay? But once we found that Sphinx cats are very much like dogs, it's incredible how sort of the personality is very friendly, unlike any other cat I've ever met. So I realized this is probably a good route to go, and he's been a fantastic pet. Our family loves him. I'm sorry you don't, but he's a wonderful pet. And we also, because he's hairless, he gets cold very easily. So we often have to put clothing, I don't have a picture of it yet, but here at least, but we have to put clothing on the cat in the winter, which is strange, because I never thought I'd be one of those people that owns a cat that has to wear clothing. So to that extent, it seems odd, but it was perfectly rational.
Well, I appreciate that you caveated a little bit. I think the personality argument, I've actually met Winston, and personality does go a long way, which it needs to, given the way he looks.
Yeah, I think that's probably right.
And so we'll leave it.
We call this trade-offs in economics.
Yes. Trade-offs.
Right.
Okay, time to pull out the notes.
All right.
And make sure I'm covering economics, and we get off the cat concept. I read something recently, Stephen, and it said, economics is not the study of money, it is the study of behavior.
Right.
You agree with that?
Absolutely. No, in fact, and this is something that I think a lot of people tend to get wrong about economics, especially if you're not in economics. And I understand this completely, because most people think economists are effectively finance analysts. And so I'll go to parties or something like this, or just events, and people who may have this point of view, they'll say, oh, well, what should I invest in? Or what's the market going to do? The right answer, even if you're a finance person, is I don't know. But economists are especially uninterested in that for the most part, because we study, arguably broadly defined, the choices people make in the context of the world in which they live and operate, which has constraints, which are costs to doing things, and incentives, which are benefits to doing things a certain way relative to the rules that you're presented. And so this is in a sense, sort of a more fundamental way of thinking about bigger issues than just the marketplace. Because money is a way to measure interactions within certain environments, but not always. Economists will often talk about how people allocate their time. within a family, for instance, or how they'll make a choice relative to the other options that are out there. One of the most important concepts in economics is the idea of what they call opportunity cost. It's basically your highest valued alternative to what you're doing. And actually this is, we can kind of dovetail into a real world application if you want to talk about, since I know we did talk about kind of where the economy might be going last year. And so thinking through, we're a year ahead of time, right? Or a year behind, not a year behind, but a year from
to your credit, when we reached out to you to have this conversation again, the first thing you said to me was, I think you should go back and listen to what I said last year and see if anything I predicted came true, which most pundits don't ask for that.
Unfortunately,
right?
That's right.
So you wanted accountability relative to your, and you didn't make a lot of predictions, but you did cast some things that we'll talk about.
And maybe that's the humble brag, and it wasn't, I guess maybe it was sort of unintentional, but I've gotten used to not making predictions, because again, things can be unpredictable in this way. But one thing you can try, I guess the one thing that economists can say, usually with a fair degree of certainty, is that if you are properly measuring, as an observer, measuring things in the economy, specifically, I should say, you're measuring institutionally things that are lined up, and you say, okay, I'll give you a good example. So right now as economists, everyone's thinking about how we're recovering from 2020, right? Everything took a nosedive in 2020 for a variety of reasons, and we can talk a little more about those later. But unemployment went up dramatically. Now, part of that was because so many businesses were shut down as a result of government action, but the truth is people are out of work. Now the question becomes, how do we recover from that, right? Now, the federal government decided, as part of the stimulus, to give to states more money to allocate to people looking or applying for unemployment benefits. Now, it was about $300, but it was a flat rate per person per week, and it was allocated to the states. Now, the states, and excuse me, I'll get in the weeds really, really quickly, but it won't be too painful. All unemployment insurance programs are state-level programs, and so they have a varying degree of the amount of money they're giving to unemployment recipients. But the federal government had a flat $300 rate. That's for everywhere. It costs less money to live in Birmingham than it does in Boston, and yet the $300 was uniform. What that means is, in some places at the lower cost of living, this was sometimes a doubling or more of the amount that would have been given to them if it was just a state-only program. Now this is a new incentive. Before, you might have had an incentive where you realized, okay, I can only replace maybe 50% of my income by staying on unemployment, but as soon as a job opens up, I will go take that job and get more money out of it. In a lot of cities, in fact, quite a number of them were 80% or more in terms of the replacement money that was coming in, right? So they could replace 80 to 100% of their income just by staying on unemployment. That's going to prolong the adjustment process. And so we're beginning to see a lot of that now. We're only now getting, because there's about a month or two lag with a lot of this macroeconomic data, we're beginning to see at the national level employment growing slower than the market predicted, or than the stock market or people investors predicted. But then you're also seeing a variation between states. States that had the most generous unemployment packages effectively are seeing slower growth in employment than the states that dialed back or might have even opted out of the federal allotment. So you can see this natural experiment going on, and all of that comes back to the premise that economists deal with and start with, which is people will make decisions, rational decisions usually, based on the costs and benefits that they're facing in the real world.
Yeah. You economists look at disasters and say, this is interesting, let's sort out what behaviors led to this disaster. Is that a fair?
Well, we look at all the things to try to figure out. Disasters are not as much fun.
You just summarized this entire impact on people's lives and all these things that were going on, right, from an economist standpoint, where it's like, well, they made rational decisions and now there are these results.
But bear in mind, the rational decision-making is occurring at the private sector level. Public sector policy-making decisions are not always, in fact, usually not rational. Now, it doesn't mean, sorry, let me rephrase this. Let me rephrase that, because rational is not the right word for it. They are rational based on the incentives that they're facing, but they're facing different incentives than people in the marketplace are, right? So if your job in government is to say...
Just to say public sector government.
Correct. Public sector is what I mean by government.
Incentives are different than individual incentives.
Right, exactly.
Okay.
Because if you're in the public sector or government, your incentive is what I call the do something impulse. It's like, we don't care what it is, just do something. So it looks like you're doing something. And oftentimes that's actually not a good incentive, and in fact, often results in bad outcomes. And so the do something impulse, especially in government, is to just throw more money at it. I'm sure we'll talk about that in a little bit too. But it's also to try to change the rules, to try to spur a certain outcome. Problem is, government doesn't really, never has all of the information they need to even make a good decision in real time. And there's certainly very difficult decision making to be gone long term, and it's going to be all flawed information anyway, because again, they don't have the incentive to get the information the way a private sector actor would, because there's money on the line in the private sector. In the public sector, in government, it's other people's money that's on the line. And so you don't have that strong an incentive to make sure you're making the right decision with that money.
Okay. So they're behaving rationally, just with different incentives.
Correct. Right.
Fair enough. So one thing that you did say last year was that increased employment mobility was going to change a lot of things. So explain what you mean by increased employment mobility, and then also dial that into Arizona for me. You did that last year, and you talked about being optimistic about Arizona partly because of that mobility, I think, was one of the key factors.
Absolutely. So before the pandemic, basically 2019 and prior, movement between states was usually well predicted by a few things. Sometimes it's climate. Literally, it's nicer to live there, which is why a lot of people were leaving the Northeast and going down to Florida or Southeast or whatever. There's also demographic patterns. The more people retire, and of course, as coming into sort of the baby boom retirement years, we've got people moving to different places. But the folks who are in their prime of their careers are now able to move far from where their actual location of employment is. That's a very new thing. Partly that's technological. But also, it's just the reality that you can work remotely for anywhere in the world, really, and still generate the kind of productivity that we would see otherwise. And of course, there's a great deal of productivity gains that come with that. For instance, working at ASU, for the past year, I have not had to commute into campus. Because granted, the campus was shut down for quite a long time there, but now that we're kind of slowly opening up again, I realized, well, let's see, I live in Phoenix, just north of here, and it takes me about, on a good day, maybe 45 minutes, sometimes a little longer if there's traffic. Then, of course, you got to find parking on campus. If you ever parked on ASU, that's actually not that easy. So that's all time. It's a time cost, right? And I figured it out. I was like, wow, I saved myself at least 7 hours a week not commuting. And that's literally almost an entire day of work, right? I save a day. And of course, you multiply it over the year. It's incredible. It's time and cost savings for telecommuting. And so these types of things are not being captured in the current productivity and GDP statistics, because those were developed at a time where this was not really an option, right? People had to live in the same place they worked. So now we're seeing this sort of disaggregation of that. What that means for a place like Arizona, especially as we are situated geographically next to a place like California, that has generally been a fairly inhospitable business climate, heavy regulation, high taxes, that means people can leave but still work for a place in California, right? And that's assuming the business stays in California. There's been a lot of businesses that have also moved out of a place like California. New York's the same way as well, where you have folks moving to Austin, Houston, Las Vegas, and Phoenix. That's where most of the migration is coming from, a lot of the bigger cities on the coasts. North Carolina is another example as well. And so you're beginning to see this movement and this pattern. What that means for the recovery, I think, in terms of employment, is every state lost a substantial amount of jobs in terms of 2020 and the decline. Then how fast they recover is going to be partly contingent upon what I talked about. That's policy decisions that were being made on things like unemployment. But an additional factor is some of the jobs that were lost in places like California are never going to come back because the people have left. The businesses have left. I might have said this last time, but if you look at rents in a place like San Francisco, it went through the floor. Because people realized when they were working for Facebook or Google or Apple in San Jose or nearby, they realized I don't have to be paying San Francisco rents to have a San Francisco job. I could work remotely, and so a lot of people moved, and not many of them, not all of them anyway, are coming back. So I think this is actually a benefit for Arizona. Now, I think we were well situated already to get a lot of these people, because in 2019 and prior years, we were beginning to see that. So I think we're going to see more of that, especially as a result of some of the policy decisions that have been made here in Arizona over the past few years, and this past year in particular. We've already been doing a great deal of work on deregulating the ability to start a business, deregulating the ability of workers to transfer their license. So let's say you have what they call an occupational license. It's basically permission to work. It's permission slip from the government to hold a job.
Right.
But these are things like anywhere from cosmetologists all the way up to lawyers and accountants and doctors and dentists. So in most professions, when you leave the state that you started in, that you had your license in, you go to another state, you've got to start the whole process over again. That could be 1 or 2 years out of the workforce and a substantial amount of money just to pay to get the school and the classes, just to get that license and pass the tests. Now in Arizona and a few other states have followed Arizona's lead. You can now move to Arizona, and if you have a license in good standing from another state, you're free and clear just to start working, hang out your shingle and start working. So that's going to make Arizona that much more attractive. And then on tax policy, it's hard to grasp kind of the significance of this if you're not like a policy geek or a tax wonk.
Yeah, get ready.
Yep, here we go. You might have heard about this tax reform.
Here comes tax policy.
Yeah. So this is sort of like a pet peeve of mine, because I've been talking about this for a long time, and I'm sure I've bored you with some of this stuff too. But the short version is, here in the state of Arizona, we have actually passed and signed into law, legislature and governor agreed to a plan that effectively creates a flat income tax for the state of Arizona. For workers, 2.5%. Be one of the lowest in the nation. Very competitive with places like, Nevada and Texas, who have 0 income taxes, but even a place like Colorado that already has a flat tax, they're at about a 4% rate. So we're getting below them. And so we're becoming more competitive on a lot of different dimensions. And I think that's only going to be good for Arizona and for Phoenix in particular, especially since most people, when they move to a state, they're moving to Phoenix. They're not really moving to other places in the state.
Yeah. Greer's a draw.
Greer's a draw for people who live in Phoenix, right? So, and this is an interesting.
I was just kidding. I don't want to get.
I like Greer.
I don't want to talk about.
We spend a lot of time in Greer.
Yeah, Greer.
We have to put a sweater on the cat when we go to Greer.
Fine. Yeah.
Right.
You made a comment in there though about GDP or other statistics are not appropriately representing the current environment because they were created for a different environment. Tell me if I'm saying this wrong.
That's basically right, yeah.
So I guess two questions. One, what changes need to be made to those to give us relevant data? Two, what data do you look at? So, particularly here in Arizona, do you wake up and there's an Economist, dashboard that you go, oh, these are the important numbers that we should look at?
Yeah, there's a certain amount of comfort in knowing when you're looking at some of this data and you know the flaws and you realize, well, this is the best we've got, so we got to work with what we have. And I also know that someone who is doing analysis elsewhere using the same numbers, they have the same problems. So it's not as if someone has an advantage over another.
Okay.
And be honest, a lot of data, anytime you see data, it's going to be flawed in some way. It's always going to miss something because the world evolves often faster than our ability to create metrics to measure those changes. Inflation is a good example. For instance, we're in a very weird period now, where it's rather difficult to know if what we're seeing with price increases now, and there's been quite a bit of inflation over the past year. Sometimes it's hard to tell when you're in the moment. Just like this transition to remote workers, it's a very weird time because we don't normally see these kinds of evolutions and migrations happen in such a condensed, compressed time frame. So now we have something like inflation where we're seeing, okay, you can see how if you have a drought and there's fewer crops, what's going to yield less food, lower supply, it's going to be higher prices. You can see that. But that's usually a temporary phenomenon, right? We're in a period where it's really hard to tell if what we're seeing is temporary or permanent, right? We see lots of people trying to get back, some people are trying to get back into the workforce, but you see a supply constraint because so many factories and manufacturing were shut down for nearly a year. And so we're only now ramping up to try to get things back up to where it used to be even just a year ago. Cars are a good example. There's car parts are hard to come by. We have a crack in our windshield now. Yeah. It's at least a month wait just to get a new windshield. Little things like that we used to take for granted. So the reason I bring that up is because, and there's also quality improvements that inflation is not very good at measuring either. So if you kind of think of all of these combined, you begin to realize that these price spikes, hard to tell if they're temporary or permanent, And then we don't even know if they're measuring the right kind of quality adjustments that we would expect. Like I would say, again, with a remote worker, if you're moving to a place with a lower cost of living, you can afford a bigger house, or at least the same size house for a lot less money than from where you came. That's an actual quality improvement, but it's not always reflected in a lot of these indices that you'll see. So anyway, all that simply to say, and that was kind of a deep dive into something that you may not have really cared about, but that in thinking through how you make comparisons over time, just looking at the time and the trends isn't going to really tell you very much unless you've got a consistent, a set of assumptions, and those are really slow to feed into the metrics.
Okay.
Yeah.
You need an
It's kind of a non-answer, wasn't it?
You need an extended period of time, and then these numbers make sense?
Well, because then what you do is you just sort of backward fill the data. So
what do you see people doing a lot of times that's the mistake? If I'm an individual and I'm looking at the data and I'm trying to use that to to make my rational decision, what mistake am I typically making?
Yeah, I want to go ahead and bash other economists. So something about economists, we're not monolithic in our approach. Like we'll all look at different things. And then there's basically the divide is sort of what they call macroeconomists, which look at the big picture. I shouldn't even at the big picture, they look at the macro economy, which is a bigger picture. But then you've got the microeconomists who are looking at firm level, worker level decisions. I tend to do more microeconomics, even though it sounds like I'm talking a lot of big macro stuff. I don't really do a lot of the big picture analysis, but that's for a reason, because I think the macroeconomists often get it wrong. And I think they invert the causation mechanism, right? So they'll look at the data and say, okay, these trends occurred and did this. We can see it correlated, means it occurred at the same time. And therefore, we'll infer a causation from that. And so all we got to do is change this big picture number, and you'll have downstream benefits, or more specifically, it'll do what we think it's going to do at the micro level. Microeconomist goes the opposite direction. It says, no, top-down stuff doesn't really work because it creates adverse incentives or it creates unintended consequences. And there's a whole host of things we could talk about and sort of how those things manifest themselves. But if you're starting at the smaller level and going up, you're less likely to make a lot of these mistakes, but you're also less likely to trust the macro numbers too when you do that.
Yeah, so the tax policy is a good example though. You say top-down doesn't work, but that's a top-down decision.
Well, from an analytical perspective. So one thing we also have to make a distinction about too is where the rules are being set. So one nice thing about the United States is that we've got 50 different laboratories, right? Different natural experiments going on. One thing we can see that even though the federal will set a specific tax rate in this particular example, you have competing tax rates that are going on individually between states. So that's when you begin to see most of the real patterns. And so yes, if you're a national macroeconomist, you may not pick up on the distributional aspects of all of this. You might think, oh, okay, everything's driven by federal tax policy. Or you might take the wrong conclusion from a tax cut, because if you cut taxes at the federal level, states may just raise their taxes. Well, that's going to make them less likely to attract new businesses, and so maybe you need to be looking at where the distribution occurs between the states.
Okay, so let me follow that a little bit, because I think generally over the last 18, 24 months, people have used the word state a lot more often. And they've talked about what's my state doing, what's your state doing, what's that state over on the East Coast doing, right? And than they did before. It was kind of macro in that sense. Is that a good perspective to take?
Oh, I definitely think so.
As an individual?
I definitely think so. Because we have to assume that people aren't going to stay in the same place that they're always, that they start, right? Yeah. So there's going to be migration. Some people do. But if you're thinking about what tends to be the more kind of remote worker, they tend to be sort of in knowledge industries. They'll be higher end professionals. Usually these are the kinds of people that states want moving to their area. And we're seeing more of it now, as I said, for people leaving high cost areas during 2020 in particular. So I do think that's a helpful thing. And that's something that, again, people in my field have talked about for a long time. And so I'm always happy when people outside our wonky circles take this into consideration. But I think you'll see more of that as you go forward, because it's now, I think, more likely that people have an ability or a confidence level, really, to go to other places and try out their luck. I also think this is partly because, again, 2020, a compressed time frame, a lot of jarring changes were made in a very short period of time. I talked about this occupational licensing thing, where you can come in from a licensed from one state and come in and get it in here. One thing that happened during the pandemic was that you began to, especially back east, in the Northeast in particular, you had a lot of states that were realizing we've got really strict licensing provisions. As a result of that, we have a lot fewer doctors per capita than a lot of the states across the United States, and certainly in the region, but we have a run on demand for medical services. Well, obviously, because you've got people flowing into hospitals with COVID cases. And so the way they handled the problem was actually the right way, which was, let's just go ahead and for a short period of time, let's go ahead and exempt everyone from the licensing requirements. They basically had was a de facto reciprocity where doctors would come in from out of state. They could stay there for as long as they were needed. And
the state licensing requirement, not just anybody could pretend to be a doctor.
Correct, state licensing,
okay.
right. So right, exactly. But this is also an important thing, because you had retired doctors who might have had a license in good standing, but they just weren't practicing anymore. Well, they can come back into service, right, at that point. So that was an example, I think, of how or why people were thinking more about creative ways of handling a crisis situation in a very short, compressed period of time that can have, I think, if done correctly, long-term beneficial implications for people across the board. One thing that economists like myself are encouraging the states who have exempted or have lowered those barriers to entry to keep them there. It's like, well, there's a reason why you had a problem in the first place. Let's not go back to that problem that you had before. We figured out a way to solve it. It was under duress, but it turned out to be the right decision. Maybe we should be thinking creatively and long-term about whether those are worth kind of keeping down. Just keep it there.
You've talked about Arizona, which I appreciate, and I think we're all trying to understand the economy at a micro and a macro level. Have you seen any data recently that gives you optimism or pessimism about Arizona's economy going forward?
Yeah, in fact, just this morning, just to show you, I actually did some homework on this. So I'm not just phoning this one in. I was looking at the employment numbers that just came out last week and this week. Now, again, one of these things about the lag is the numbers that come out recently will be for the month prior, but in order to get the state breakdowns, you got to wait 2 months. And so the numbers I'm talking about are for June and July, basically. Okay. But looking at the July numbers, most states, in fact, virtually all, are not quite up to where they were in July of 2020. And only about 10 states are better than they were in February of 2020. So including Arizona. Arizona is not in the lucky 10 that are above where they were in February last year, or meaning from February 21 to 20, or July.
It's not luck, Stephen, it's rational choices.
No. So this
sorry, stay aside. We're not in the top 10, sorry.
That's right, no. But again, this is all built on people making decisions. Yeah. And in fact, that's actually crucial, because we're seeing the states that decided to put more limits and strict limits on how much or how long you can receive unemployment benefits are actually recovering better than the states, and Arizona is one of those states that opted out. We're recovering better than other states when you compare where we were relative to a year ago. We're not exactly there yet. I mean, we've got, I think we're like 1% down from where we were this time last year. But there's other states that are 2% where they were. Now, a lot of them are, Hawaii is a good example. Their tourism industry got slaughtered, and it hasn't recovered very well. Yeah. A lot of places, Florida is also in a similar situation. And so it's hospitality. So specific industries are being hurt more than others. But on the whole, Arizona is recovering quite well. And I think part of the reason, and relative to other states as well, I think part of the reason for that is we're getting people in from other states. As I said, a lot of these jobs are probably not going to come back. I'm making more predictions now than I did last year. So if you have me back next year, you can kind of hold this over my head and say, see, you're wrong. But I do think a lot of these jobs are going to be permanently gone from a place like California. And they may have moved to Arizona, but they've also may have moved to Texas too. But the point is, the relative changes is what you need to be thinking and when looking long term about where states are being positioned.
So unemployment is what you went to as a real key indicator. Mm-hmm. I want to talk about feelings.
Sure. I'm here for it.
Okay, good. So we're going to get to feelings. Guys, can I get a clock on this screen, though, so I make sure I'm ready for the Q&A? Feelings right now are hard around the economy. They're jumbled. I think a lot of people, including myself, see data, articles, have conversations, and the sky is falling or could fall, right. Probably will fall. But whenever I talk to you, who knows more about it than anybody I know, you have a
You're going to get a wider group of friends.
You have
Sorry.
Maybe.
That was mean.
you have a smile on your face, and I can't tell if that is kind of a, Mr. Bigglesworth, right? Awesome. Like you're an evil genius of some kind who just likes to analyze it and smiles because he's figured it out, or because I should be more optimistic when I look at this stuff. And if so, why would I be optimistic?
Okay. I'm generally optimistic I'm generally bullish about the long term. And I think one thing
when you say the long term, the Arizona, the U.S., the global economy?
When I mean long term, I'm actually specifically referring to a time frame. So usually when I think about long term, it'll be 3 years and beyond. Short term will be 3 years. A lot of people tend to focus.
So keep going.
Sure,
okay.
But that's just it. If you're in the middle of a cycle, it's hard to tell which part of it you're on, right? But over the long term, it's easier to see that because that's exactly where you end up, right? So the point would be, getting fixated in the short term is not as useful. It's actually worse for your mental health probably, because you're seeing a lot of these things ebb and flow and you're thinking, okay, if I'm on the downswing, it's never gonna end until it does. And then it does, and you go, oh, well, I feel better about this. But you're thinking the long term, it's always gonna, it's gonna be cyclical.
Yeah, the reason but did you and Crystal buy toilet paper?
What's that?
Did you and Crystal go out and buy toilet paper?
Oh yeah, well, Crystal kind of had a problem with this. So there was a lot of toilet paper purchases
come up
going on. No, I don't want to embarrass. I've already embarrassed her
Because I'm
enough.
just pushing back on that because yes, I get it from a broader economist, but like in your family,
right?
You got to make a quick decision about some of these things.
And there were toilet paper shortages, so it was perfectly rational under the circumstances.
Yeah.
But I knew long term that wasn't something that we needed to worry about. I wasn't clearing up more space in the garage for toilet paper. I knew at some point we'll work through this and it'll end up going right back to where it was before. And I think that's kind of where we are in some things, not everything, right? Some supply chain issues are, I don't want to get too detailed here, but here's what I would say.
Long-term optimism.
Long-term optimist. I'm not even a short-term pessimist per se, although I can be cynical about the short term. But what I would argue is that the reason I'm a long-term optimist is because even with, and I will give you some caveats here, and we can talk more about the one or few things that I'm a little pessimistic about and concerned about. Because there are some. I'm not entirely optimistic across the board. And I know you've got them written down, so we'll talk about it in a second. But I'm a long-term optimist because even though government has a tendency to create rules that often create bad outcomes, markets find a way. I've quoted the philosopher Ian Malcolm before.
Nice.
Life finds a way. So markets will often find a way. And you'll see lots of things that occur at the micro level that are often done because they're trying to deal with a bad hand they've been dealt. So that's why I'm a long-term optimist, because these things often find a way, even though it looks like in the short term they're being trampled upon by bad rules or bad business cycles or something. Okay. But I can tell you one thing I'm concerned about, because I know we're going to talk about national debt.
Yeah, if we have time, we're just going to, address national debt.
I don't want to jump the queue if you've got another.
Small issue.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So I mean, well, it's obviously.
So what are you pessimistic about?
So that's the one thing. That's the one thing I say pessimistic about, but I'm not sure why. And it's going to sound weird to say that, but here's what I mean by that. The national debt, right? So here's why I'm concerned about it, but I'm not yet sure if I need to be a complete pessimist about it. And that's because for the past, 50, 60 years or so, economists have generally been worried about debt levels that reach 80 to 100% of GDP, meaning the amount of debt that the federal government issues because they are spending more than they're taking in. And for the US, for the most part, unless you're looking at World War II, which is a very anomalous period of time, you're looking at, you're going to be under 80%, pretty much. If you look at where we've been since 2008, 2009, thereabouts, it has been a very quick spike upward. We're now at about 125% of percent of GDP, up from about 80 or 90%. That's really worrisome. Now, the problem is, at least from an analytical perspective, we're not seeing the kinds of weird impacts you would expect to see with debt levels that are so high. So the fear that I've got is maybe it just hasn't hit yet. Now, I feel like I'm scaring everyone needlessly. It's like I am still a long-term optimist, and I think there's reasons why some of these problems, including debt issues, may solve themselves, or more specifically be solved when you get to a kind of a crisis, burning platform mentality among policymakers at the federal level. But the short-term uncertainty that comes with things like national debt or monetary policy, that's the worry that I've got in the short term, is the uncertainty. So I do think policymakers can clear up a lot of the uncertainty by having a very cogent, coherent plan for dealing with these issues. Problem is they haven't really done that yet. Okay. So I think in the short term, the misgiving I've got is the uncertainty that may come with national policy, even state policies in some respects, and also just the knowledge that I think it's going to take a little bit of time for people to relearn how to assess risk. I feel like the last year has pummeled so many people. Individuals. Okay. I think, because we used to be able to deal with risk pretty well. I'm not talking about buying insurance for your car or for life insurance. I'm talking about just the mere fact that getting in a car is a risk in the morning. Going into a place unmasked is a risk. People can decide their spectrum of risk, but I think there's a lot more uncertainty about what risk levels people should be willing to take or want to take on their own, that I think kind of getting this reticence back, this more durable ability to deal with risk back into play. And that's not really something economists think much about. That's kind of psychology in a lot of ways, although there's a lot of economists who try to do psychology as well. Yeah. They're not always successful. But I think there's an interesting, immeasurable thing here that maybe there's part of this explanation that is something economists don't have the tools to deal with right now. And so I think over time, I think we'll probably have ways of figuring this out. But for now, that's the short-term uncertainty that I think might be a bigger issue.
Okay, feed my fear for a second.
All right.
You said the national debt is an area of concern for you.
Mm-hmm.
You just explained really well why it would be, but you didn't say what would happen.
Oh, sure.
Like what would just one thing that would happen or you would expect as an economist to happen now that the national debt is 125% of GDP?
Okay, so I'll give you what the general literature predicts might happen at debt levels like this. Some of them, I think, are reasonable. Some of them probably aren't very reasonable. I'll give you both types.
Okay.
The literature on this indicated that any debt levels above 80 to 90% are generally bad for economic growth on average. And the reason for that is because usually if what you're doing is, if you have a lot of money swallowed up in bonds, and that's basically what we're talking about. The government issues bonds. The Federal Reserve buys a lot of those bonds, but independent market, finance, people running portfolios and such, both in the US and internationally, they buy those bonds as well. So one of the downstream impacts of really high debt levels is there might come a point where people just stop buying your debt because they realize, well, maybe this is not a very reliable long-term investment anymore because maybe there'll be some defaults.
Okay.
And they would be right to think that if they're dealing with Thailand or Malaysia or even Russia, they defaulted on their bonds back in the 90s or early 2000s. So, and that's where most of the historic averages come from, is looking at much smaller economies than the US. So there was even some reticence early on to think.
And what happens if people do that?
So basically you can actually tank an economy. In a smaller economy.
What does that mean, tank an economy?
I'm sorry, let me rephrase this. It can basically drag down economic growth to the point where they don't have the ability to invest in businesses, nationally. Because so let's say a lot of because a lot of these smaller countries will have kind of backward type of investment structures where you've got a lot tied up in debt because they need the debt for the purpose of kind of creating, say, infrastructure for roads. This is more of a government-centered one, not so much a private sector one. But if you default on your debt, everyone starts withdrawing their money.
Okay.
You can't, suddenly investment that wasn't in government bonds also dries up. And so as a result of that, that has very far-reaching ripple effects, right? Yeah. But those are generally for much smaller economies than the US. So there's a theory going on that maybe we can sustain levels above 100%. Well, that's also a problem because there's still a crowding out effect, right? There may still come a point where people decide, well, this is really not a good investment. We're not there yet, it seems. And a lot of us thought maybe 100% would be where you start seeing this, but you're not seeing that. But there's also the concern that if you have so much money tied up in something like national debt, first of all, you're foisting these bills on the future, on people who haven't been born yet, right? Future generations. And that's going to necessitate higher taxes in the future to pay for those sorts of things because the amount of stuff we're spending on doesn't seem to go down. It seems to go up every generation or every year for that matter. So these obligations are going to stay where they are, especially things like Social Security and Medicare. As people get older, there's going to be this really big disconnect between what people are expecting the government to give them and what the government can actually give them based on the amount of money they're collecting. So that's where the debt comes in. So you have this big debt overhang. That could mean real problems in the future. Now here I am talking about how I'm long-term optimistic for the future, and yet there's this big looming issue. That's the only looming issue, I think, that could be a real existential concern for the long-term optimism I have, I guess.
Okay. Yeah, and if you're in a future where taxes have to be jacked up quite a bit, or the benefits that people expect from the government are not available to them, feelings can come back into play real quick, and people can start behaving irrationally. Now you're feeding my fear.
There you go.
I'm
glad
I appreciate
I'm glad
that.
I could do that. But
Okay, so long-term optimism, national debt creates some, it just sounds like the economists are in disarray about that.
Yeah,
kind of like, whoa, this is not happening the way we were expecting it to happen. You're looking at employment data. I really like that piece. Are you looking at like the real estate data or any other investments in Arizona where you go, where you think?
I'm not actually looking at that.
You don't look at the real
I don't
estate.
look at that. That's very difficult because you can see price increases occurring back in 2006, 2007, 2008 that look similar to what we have now, and yet things don't look the same way in other ways, like inventory or something. And so it's very difficult. That's a cyclical data set that kind of scares me, and so I don't look at it. So I really wouldn't want to invest any amount of confidence that I would give you in that sort of thing. But I'm looking at that. But I do think if you look, so there is a certain stability in things like employment numbers that you wouldn't get from some of those cyclical data sets like housing.
Really?
And again, some of these things will probably, quote, take care of themselves. And so part of the reason you might say that there's an increase in housing prices is because we have people moving in, right? So the market has to react to that. We have X number of, a finite amount of houses, people moving in. Actually, it's the problem to have, right? If you have fewer houses, people moving in, and so that's what's driving the price up. But you also have to think about, well, what's the market response? The market response is, we'll build more housing because there's a profit, a profit opportunity here. Some places that's difficult to do because there's very strict zoning requirements, very strict environmental regulations that might be overweening or kind of beyond a reasonable standard. And so California, again, is a good example of that. It's hard to build in a place like California. And so housing was already really expensive to begin with. But a place like Arizona, we don't have as many restrictions in that way. So in a place like Arizona, I would say, we're probably going to build our way out of some of these issues. And so those price increases, these aren't going to be like bubble mansions like we saw in 2008, right? These are going to be real, actual, value increases,
a settling potentially, but not a...
Right, exactly. So again, but I wouldn't want to predict too much on that one because there are
you
cycles,
already did.
right? I know.
Sorry.
Yes. Now I've
Walked
totally
right
shot
into
myself
it.
in the foot on this one. but I think it's important. It goes back to the thing I said about inflation too, right? You don't know if it's a short-term or a long-term phenomenon, and there's good reasons to think why some of these things are just short-term. But again, in a place like in an environment like this where you are seeing people come in, if you saw massive house appreciation in places where people were leaving, there might be a weird thing. I don't really often see that, but it's possible. So it's a very weird thing to think through that. But I think as long as you've got robust employment growth, which has ripple effects, right? People moving in need services. They need stuff to buy, and they need places to work. And so all of these things are tied together. So I think something like employment is usually a pretty good thing to look at over the long and over the short term as well, as a kind of a predictive mechanism.
Perfect. Okay. Good one. Thank you. All right. Questions from the audience have been submitted. I now have a screen here. It's flashing.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah. Number 1, Disneyland versus Disney World.
Oh, interesting. Okay.
What can we learn about how Disneyland shut down during COVID while Disney World remained open?
Wow, that's interesting.
We've got 10 minutes. We're going to make sure everybody gets out on time.
So here's the thing. I'm not so sure. Everyone's going to hate me for that. I don't really have a good answer for this. Now, that doesn't mean this isn't an interesting natural experiment, because one of the best things about what we're seeing now is how dramatically different reactions state governments had to what was going on, and city governments too, had relative to what happened, right? I think it's going to be very difficult to figure out the answer to this question because of a lot of what you might call confounding factors, right? Because the hospitality industry took a massive hit. Not just because they had trouble finding employees and getting employees back for reasons that we've already discussed, but also just what they call the demand for the product. People really weren't as willing to travel to some places as they were to others. So whether Disney World benefited from being open is still an unclear question, right? It may have just been the case that more people were willing just to go to Florida generally, but maybe they weren't, right? So at the moment, I think it's too soon to tell. But if I was, I don't want to predict, but so the question to ask would be, from a research perspective, is adjusting for all other factors, which you can do, analytically, Did you see, say, an increase in ticket sales for Disney World relative to Disneyland? But again, the adjusting for other factors is the tricky part.
Yeah.
Like, are people more likely to go to Disney World anyway because it's much bigger than Disneyland? Disneyland is like a Lilliputian version of Disney World for some weird reason. Disney World is far superior. Maybe people are going there for that reason, right?
Right.
So.
Okay, good. Question number 2. How will redrawn lines of supply chain
I think I understand what they're saying.
Okay, good. I don't. Affect the Arizona economy as a whole, and specifically labor in terms of white and blue collar jobs.
Okay, so the supply chain issues are bigger than just Arizona, obviously, right? We're talking about international supply lines. And supply chain specifically, and I think that term's important because not every supply chain, because they're not monolithic, right? Not every supply chain has the same problems, right? Some of them have worse problems than others.
Okay.
So I think what that would mean for white and blue collar jobs, I think there's 2 things going on. The first is, again, on the employment side, even if you restored a supply chain, physically moving things out the door requires labor, right? You need employees to do that. And if you're having trouble, if you're an industry that's having trouble moving things out the door, the restaurant industry is a good example. It's hard to get service workers into the restaurant industry for whatever reason. So you could still have a supply chain that provides inputs, i.e. food and things like that at a reasonable cost, but getting it out the door is going to be difficult because you don't have people to actually serve the table, wait the tables. But however, what you might call white-collar jobs, the knowledge economy jobs, those never really stopped. The supply chain for geeky, wonky economists who occasionally play drums, my workflow has never stopped. It's been consistent because I've worked at home, right? I blather on about this stuff all the time for fun, and occasionally you let me come in and talk about it. So this is my productivity. This is what I produce, which some, like my father-in-law would say, that's like nothing. Why would you do that? It produces nothing. But he produces like physical stuff, tractors and things and trucks and stuff, right? So there's supply lines that go into that too. But I think the employment stuff, it's going to be impacted depending on what industry you're in. And frankly, the white-collar jobs, knowledge economy workers have had a much better time of it than blue-collar workers. So that is a real disparity, I think. And again, looking at the employment numbers, you wouldn't know that. You would have to dig down deeper to go by industry and then think about classifying those by different ways or in different ways.
Real disparity there. I like that. That's a good point. Okay. Recommendations, books, podcasts, media to help me better understand economics to guide my family.
Okay, I have a couple books, and I have at least one podcast.
Great.
So in terms of books, I like books that take the basic concept of economics, which is what we just discussed.
Yeah.
Individuals making decisions subject to uncertainty or constraints and incentives. And that's the basic gist of economics. And frankly, that's really all you need to know, in my opinion, to do good economic analysis. Now, you can get tripped up along the way, but the books that do that best, in my opinion, there's 2 of them. One's called Economics in One Lesson by a guy named Henry Hazlitt. And you can get but this book was written in the 40s and 50s, it might have been 50s or 60s. So it can be a little dated in its examples, but it's called Economics in One Lesson for a reason. It basically fleshes out that lesson I just said, and then applies it to a set of different contexts or different questions, right? And you see how the logic is consistent throughout all of those questions. But the second one that goes a little broader than that is called Common Sense Economics and I'm biased here because it's co-authored by one of my professors as an undergrad professor at Florida State University, a guy named James Gwartney, Gwartney. And you can also get this on Amazon. And it's Common Sense Economics. So it basically it sort of flips it around. It basically uses the basic intuition I outlined, but it focuses more on kind of the examples and sort of distilling the basic ideas of economics kind of in that way. In terms of podcasts, one of my favorite podcasts is something called Econ Talk, which is hosted by a guy named Russ Roberts, who used to be at where I got my grad degree, George Mason University out in the DC area. But he's actually now, he's going on to take a job as the president of Yeshiva University in Israel.
Really?
So he's in the United States for a while, but he'll keep doing this podcast. He's been doing it for like 10 years or something. So there's a very large backlog of episodes to listen to. So it's going to take you a long time to go through, but just pick stuff because it's an hour long. They always try to keep it under an hour. And they always have interesting guests that span the gamut, and sometimes even go outside of economics. So he'll have all sorts of people, like psychologists, historians, social scientists, all sorts of stuff, including economists as well. But he's an economist himself, Dr. Russ Roberts. And so he will come at it from an economist perspective. And so even when he's not talking to another economist, he will say, well, economists would think this. What is your reaction? So, and it's very interesting to hear him interact with people who don't have an economics background because, of course, first of all, he'll help you understand how economists think about questions that you haven't heard economists talk about. But then there's also pushback from non-economists saying, well, that's weird. Right? What about people's feelings? And then he'll explain why economists would think the way they do about that. So it's a fun, interesting way of doing things. And you can pick and choose. It's not like there's not like a long, multi-episode narrative. So I mean, each one is a discrete individual one. So those would be my recommendations for that.
Good. I think that's a good one to wrap up on. We're going to invite David Stockton up here in a second. Stephen, I don't even know what it's like to live being so smart. It just must be. It must be exciting and overwhelming at the same time. That's all I can imagine.
Well, that's very kind.
It's nice and also a burden. Well, but I don't know.
Having a hairless cat helps.
Winston is soothing.
I don't believe that
at all.
He is my comfort animal.
At all.
That's it.
Well, I appreciate you taking the time. Let's give Stephen a hand for coming in.
Appreciate it.